On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is The Family Roe, An American Story by Joshua Prager, and features author Joshua Prager and moderator David Johnson. David Johnson is the digital media editor for Offbeat, a monthly music and entertainment magazine in New Orleans. He serves on the boards of the State Library of Louisiana and the Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival. Previously, he served as editor of publications at the New Orleans Museum of Art and editor of Louisiana Cultural Vistas and NOLA, the Digital Encyclopedia of Louisiana, projects of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Joshua Prager has written for Vanity Fair, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. A former Harvard Nieman Fellow, he is the author of The Echoing Green, a Washington Post Best Book of the Year, and lives in New Jersey. Ladies and gentlemen, Joshua Prager and David Johnson.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to the 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. We're coming to you virtually this year. I'm David Johnson. I'm here in New Orleans. I'm a journalist and an editor and a very proud board member of the State Library of Louisiana. Today, I'm joined by Joshua Prager. It's a privilege to have him here. He's a journalist who has written for Vanity Fair, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He's a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and a Fulbright Distinguished Chair. He's the author of The Echoing Green and another book, The 100 Years, and he's coming to us from his home in New Jersey, where he lives with his wife and two daughters. His most recent book is The Family Roe, and Roe is referencing the landmark 1973 U.S. Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, which of course established a woman's right to have an abortion largely free of state interference. And Joshua has spent 10 years tracing this story. And I appreciate that you called it an American story. And of course you used the word family, because you've made this a very human story. And of course, Roe was the pseudonym for Norma McCorvey, who was the plaintiff in that case. Now that case originated in Texas, but Norma's story and the story of her family largely starts here in Louisiana. And Joshua, I know you start there in the first chapter of the book. And I thought we might begin by talking about Norma's ancestry and the unplanned pregnancies that upended the lives of her own mother and grandmother.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to speak to you and delighted to speak to an audience in Louisiana, because as you say, the book begins in Louisiana and it runs through it. The Atchafalaya River is for me sort of a symbol. It's where Norma's family really took root in this country, and it's where the story ends when her ashes are sprinkled in that river. And so I came to feel for Louisiana in the course of writing this book. I visited it several times, and so I'm delighted to speak about it. But yeah, you mentioned the word family. And for me, that title, The Family Roe, has two meanings. There's the family that refers to the immediate family of Norma and the three daughters she gave birth to and then relinquished to adoption. Three daughters born with different men. And then there is the larger family of, the way I look at it, the tens of millions of Americans in this country who are connected to Roe in various ways. And both families are fractured. And Norma was sort of the matriarch of these two families. She starts off pro-choice, becomes pro-life. I mention that because, as you say, yes, her own family was upended by unwanted pregnancies. And I said to myself, in order to tell this story properly, in order to look at the larger family through the sort of smaller family, I need to know more about Norma's family. Now we can talk about more about the fact that Norma was an incredibly unreliable narrator. She lied endlessly. So I needed on my own to sort of get to know this family. And so I did. And when I began to look into the family and meet members of the family, as often happens in any family, these secrets started to emerge. People spoke to me about things they didn't really speak to each other about. And Norma's grandmother was 17 years old when she got pregnant. She was not yet married. This, of course, was a scandal. She was the daughter of the man who worked on a farm along with a farmer named Amar Gautreaux. And they were not married. They were both Catholic, and they very quickly married. And what was so interesting to me was when their daughter then got pregnant before she was married in 1940, that first pregnancy was in 1923, their daughter was also 17 when she had an unwanted pregnancy. And this time, something much more severe happened and took place and upended her life forever, and thereby upended her daughter Norma's life as well. And that was, she was sort of disappeared from this little town along the Atchafalaya River. She was made to go to Baton Rouge, where her uncle and aunt lived. And when she gave birth to her child, that child was then raised by her parents, the ones who had married in haste 17 years prior. And so this poor woman, Mary, Norma's mother, Jane Roe's mother, had to give up her own child, pretend the child was not hers. And that had devastating consequences for her and her entire family.
Yes, of course, these are stories that have played out from time immemorial. Now, of course, as an adult, Norma moves, or as a young woman, as a child, she moved to Texas. And can you tell us a little bit about her trajectory from there, what her family life was like once they moved to Texas?
Yeah, so she was actually a toddler when they left Louisiana and went to Texas. As I mentioned, her grandparents and her parents started off Catholic, then they became Pentecostal. And then soon after they arrive in Texas, Norma's mother, Mary, the one whose life had been sort of so upended by that pregnancy, she, ever since she had been made to relinquish her child to her mother, she began to drink. She became an alcoholic. She also started to sleep with many of the folks she served alcohol to in those bars where she was working. And Norma's father was hoping for sort of a new start. And so they all became Jehovah's Witnesses. And Norma, as a young girl, was made along with her brother. She didn't know, by the way, about her half sibling who was being raised by her grandmother. She didn't know that that woman was actually her half sister. She thought it was her aunt. But anyway, she and her brother were made to sort of peddle copies of the Watchtower, I believe. I'm trying to remember what it was called. Yep, the literature that the Jehovah's Witnesses gave out. And among the many thou shalt nots that she was aware of, even as a very little girl, was abortion. And she then watches her own family sort of begin to break all of these thou shalt nots. She's mindful that her mother is sleeping around. Her father becomes sullen and is often by himself. Her brother is troubled. There's a lot of problems in this family. And Norma, when she hits puberty, when she's about 12 or 13 years old, she becomes, by her own description and that of her aunts and uncles, a real wild child. I also had a chance to speak to Norma's own mother, who remembered beating her. She used profanities to describe how she beat her. And the reason she beat her, she told me without any remorse, was that when Norma was then sent off to a school for quote unquote delinquent children, she began to sleep with girls. She came out as a lesbian, and this horrified her mother, and her mother hoped to quote unquote beat her straight. That of course did not work. And Norma was 16 years old when she then got married to a man. That marriage lasted just a few months, and she ended up divorced and giving birth to her first child. That child, Norma, was completely unfit to be a mother. And that child, in this sort of weird way of this cyclical way of seeing these patterns repeat themselves in this family, as they do in all families, Norma then gave up her child to her mother. Norma lied, told everyone that her mother kidnapped her child, but actually she begged her mother to take the child off her hands and to raise that child. And the mother, Mary, adopted legally that child. And so by the time Norma was sort of a teenager, she was already living a sort of very disjointed, complicated life. She was gay. She worked in lesbian bars. She had scores of partners, occasionally slept with men, but usually slept with women. And then when she had another affair with a man, she had another unwanted child, relinquished that child to adoption. And that brings us up to Roe, because then in 1969, she's just turning 22 years old. She gets pregnant for the third time, and she's desperate not to go through this sort of relinquishment of children again. She wants to have an abortion, but of course, abortion is illegal, and her doctor tells her that he will not perform one.
And of course, she did seek legal counsel. Tell us who she approached first and how that case got going.
Well, what's really interesting, as I say, Norma lied a lot, and there were so many lies always I needed to untangle. And the nice thing was when you'd sort of get close to the truth and say to Norma, so what about this fact that you seem not to be speaking honestly about? And then she would sort of laugh and say, well, I prefer my version. We can talk more about that. I think she liked to see herself not as a sinner, meaning someone who, for example, would be sleeping with another woman, but as a victim. So to give one example, she told people that a relationship she had with another woman in Catholic school, that she said that she had been raped over and again. But anyway, so she's now not wanting to carry this child. And I mentioned those lies because another lie takes root. She tells people later on that she went to go find an abortion clinic, but it had just been shuttered and there was blood on the floor, and she paints this very sort of dramatic picture. In fact, what had happened, and the way I was able to sort of, learn these things factually, was I went back and always looked to find the earliest interview that she gave, maybe 15 years before she came up with some dramatic story. She told the truth. And I discovered her private papers, which enabled me to do that. Well, one of the stories that she told, again, was of this dramatic shuttered clinic, when in fact, she had found an abortion provider in Texas, illegal, of course, this is pre-Roe, but safe, but she simply could not afford it. It was $500 more dollars than she had. And so she's very upset and says, well, and she also didn't have the money to fly out of state. Abortion was legal, for example, in California, where Governor Ronald Reagan had signed that law into effect. He was then pro-choice, of course. She ends up going to the same lawyer who had brokered her the adoptions of her two first children. And his name is Henry McCluskey. He's a fascinating man. And she says, Henry, I really want to have an abortion. And he says, you know what? It's funny you mention that, because someone I went to law school with is a woman named Linda Coffey. And she just told me that she wants to challenge the Texas laws against abortion, and she's looking for a plaintiff. Norma says, what's a plaintiff? He says, someone who will file a suit. And, would you like to do this? And she says, yes. She's thinking and hoping that it still might enable her to have an abortion. At that point, it is, however, too late for her, but she becomes Jane Roe. And the suit is filed in March of 1970. And 2 months later, she gives birth to that child, that third child, who is again then given up for adoption.
And you say you were surprised to find that she had given birth to that child, which may surprise a lot of Americans. Of course, a pregnancy is much shorter than a protracted legal case that took 4 years. How did you discover the story of Baby Roe, and then from there, what prompted you to pursue this as the subject of your book?
Yeah, it's one of these funny things. It's so obvious in retrospect. A pregnancy is 9 months, and this lawsuit took years. She became pregnant in 1969. The Supreme Court didn't decide Roe until January of 1973. Well, many years later, in 2010, I was reading an article in the New Yorker magazine about gay marriage, and it happened to mention plaintiffs who had been difficult for the causes they represented. Norma had famously switched from the pro-choice to the pro-life side. And it then mentioned in passing that she had not been able to have the abortion she sought. And I said to myself, wow, think about that. That means that somewhere there's a boy or a girl out there whose conception occasioned the lawsuit Roe, and they're now 40 years old. They probably, I said to myself, it turned out correctly, they probably somehow have learned who they were born to over these 40 years. And if they have, that would be a very difficult thing to be burdened with, a difficult thing to carry. Abortion and Roe is so fraught in this country. And so I wanted to find out who this person was. And there was no information on the internet, but it told me, the internet, that the pro-life community looked at this unknown child as the sort of living incarnation of their argument against abortion. And so I was fascinated, and I turned to Norma. She would not speak with me because she said I had to pay her. I explained I'm not allowed to do that as a journalist. She told me what I could go do with myself. And then I started reading about her and found that she had had a partner of many years named Connie Gonzalez, a remarkable woman, probably the only person, I should say, who cared more about Norma McCorvey than Jane Roe. She was totally uninterested in the plaintiffship. She simply loved Norma. And Norma was not a good partner. She cheated on her endlessly. She was incredibly combustible. There was verbal abuse. It was a very difficult thing. And yet Connie stood by her. Well, after Connie had a stroke, a few years after that, Norma left her. And unbeknownst to me, Norma had just left her 1 year prior when I turned to Connie and visited her at her home in Dallas. This was the home where Connie had lived with Norma. And when I went back to visit Connie a second time, the next year in early 2011, she told me, along with her niece, who was her caretaker, she said, my home is about to be foreclosed on. And by the way, Norma's private papers are in the garage. Would you like to see them? And I said, yes, I would. In fact, what are you going to do with them? I said. She said, we're throwing them out. I said, please do not throw those papers out. Those are important papers. Can I have them? She said, yes. I then turned to Norma and asked if she wanted them. And she said, no. I said, can I buy them from you? And she said, yes. And she sold them to me. I later sold those papers to a research library at Harvard. The money that I got from them helped me to sort of get to the finish line. This book took me forever to finish. And when the book was done, I gave the proceeds of that sale to Norma's children. But anyway, I took those papers home. Actually, I took them to the friend's house where I was staying that night in Texas. And on that very first night, I went through all of them. And at 3 a.m, I found one piece of paper that had the date of birth of the Roe baby. Norma had mentioned this in an interview she gave to a Catholic newsletter. And to press fast forward on already a long story, it was another year until that child agreed to speak with me. And then she was excited to. She wanted to get to know her other sisters, and I found them too. And then a few years later, when Norma's mother, Mary, died, and I went to her wake along with Norma's children, 2 of the 3 children, it was there I met Norma. By that point, I'd been working with the children for a few years. And Melissa, the eldest child, was the one who knew Norma because she had been given up by Norma to her own mother. She said to Norma, please cooperate with Josh. He's doing something important. We'd like this story to be told. And so Norma started to work with me.
Right. And of course, the name of Baby Roe was Shelly Lynn Thornton. And you describe how she came to know this identity, her linkage to the Supreme Court case in a really awkward way.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could describe how this news reached her.
It's a horrible way. Basically, Norma, when in 1989, Norma was starting to become a much more public figure. She went to a women's march in DC, and it was at that women's march that the famous lawyer Gloria Allred sort of spotted her and took her to Los Angeles, almost immediately for press and talks and fundraisers. And what ended up happening was, within weeks of that meeting of Norma and Gloria, Norma announced publicly that she would like to find the Roe baby. Obviously, this would lead to a lot more press and speaking, etc. Well, Norma turned to the National Enquirer, to the tabloid, which then reached out to an investigator, who then found Shelly. She approached her in a parking lot as she was walking as a teenager from her home in Washington State. I believe it was Kent, Washington. She was walking off to get a tan at a tanning salon. She was, as she said it, just sort of a happy-go-lucky teen. She'd had some ups and downs and struggled with certain torments like anyone else, but life was pretty good. And all of a sudden, when she learns who her biological mother is, everything changes, because the National Enquirer tells her that they're going to go ahead with their story whether she likes it or not, and she did not want them to. She got a lawyer who finally prevailed upon them not to mention her name, but henceforth, all of a sudden, Shelly had these two horrible things she was carrying. The first was this sort of secret. She felt that if anyone knew who she was, her life would never be the same again. And the second thing was, as had been explained to her by the National Enquirer reporter, the pro-life community saw her as a symbol, and she wanted no part of that. She wanted to just be Shelly Lynn Thornton. Even though her family at that time was pro-life, it was too much weight upon her shoulders. And so when I found her many years later, more than 20 years later, she had been carrying this for a long time and was very wary. I've written about people before who have had big secrets that they've carried. It's something I'm interested in. And it had been my experience that it is a positive thing to be unburdened of that secret. And over time, I think Shelly agreed. And she said to me at our very first meeting, secrets and lies are the two worst things. And so it was nice to be able to work together with her, even though she was wary, understandably.
There's a lot of unburdening revelations in this book, and I really commend you as a journalist for finding a rapport and being able to bring out these secrets. I want to go back and talk about the case and the two lawyers most associated with it, of course, Sarah Weddington, who got most of the acclaim for it, but also Linda Coffey. And if you could just tell us a little bit about both of these women and why they took up the case and where their lives went from there.
Yeah, so everyone knows Sarah Weddington. She was 26 years old when she famously argued the case in front of the Supreme Court, and she became a hero to the pro-choice movement. There's a center named after her. She won 1 million humanitarian awards. She ended up going to work for the Carter White House. She became a celebrity. And no one knows her co-counsel, the woman Linda Coffey. And I became interested in Linda Coffey. It was, after all, Linda Coffey who found Norma through her friend Henry McCluskey, and she conceived of the case. She filed the case. Unlike Sarah Weddington, it was only Coffey who had the confidence and the sort of conviction to attach her name to the case when it was filed. And she really was the mother of this case, more than Sarah Weddington, who then took it over when it was argued in front of the Supreme Court. Linda also argued half of the case when it was at the district court level. But here's the thing. She was someone who hated the spotlight as much as Sarah loved the spotlight. And so Sarah was very happy taking the recognition of two, and Coffey was very happy ceding that recognition. Well, it's very sad, sort of fast forward. Linda, when I found her, was living in a house with her partner in East Texas. That house had no heat. She was on food stamps, and she was completely forgotten. Her own local newspaper called her an historical footnote. And I really wanted to sort of, while writing about her honestly, complications and all, restore her to her place in history. And when you look back at Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey's beginnings and how they came to this, it's fascinating how much has changed. So first of all, Sarah Weddington was, not a person you would have imagined would be representing a case about abortion. She was like the head of her Future Homemakers Association of America chapter and all that. But she had gotten pregnant when she was in college or maybe law school. And she had not wanted to have that. She didn't want to become a mother. And so she went south of the border with her boyfriend, who became her husband and then her ex-husband, Ron Weddington. She went and she had an abortion. And that experience, as I write about over and again in this book, how personal experience is really what lies behind so much conviction in the world. And it's therefore important for us to be exposed to personal experience. But her experience was what led her into this case. Linda, meantime, which is fascinating, was a member of the Southern Baptist Convention. Her family, they were religious Baptists. The church was sort of the central point of her life. And what I did not know, which is amazing to me that this was the case, but until 1980, the Southern Baptist Convention was ardently pro-choice. And so Linda Coffey was at home. She was able to be both a member of the Baptist Church and a lawyer filing Roe v. Wade. Over time, not only did that church change its stance and become, absolutely pro-life, but also it came out against gay marriage. Linda's gay. It came out. It issued statements about how the wife in a family needs to be subservient to the husband. And so in every way, she felt that she no longer was at home in her church. And this had devastating emotional consequences for her.
And you mentioned, again, the personal experience is what led a lot of these people into the movement, be it pro-life or pro-choice. One of the other people you write about extensively is Dr. Curtis Boyd, and I think we should hear more about him as well. And if you could just give us an introduction to him. And he was, of course, an abortion provider, but what led him into his career choices?
Yeah, so the way I approached this book was I wanted to humanize these issues. I wanted to be able to write about every aspect of abortion in America through the life of a human being, so that people would be able to look at these issues and understand these issues and get their arms around these enormous issues, not through politics, but people. Everything would be organic to someone's story. So we had Linda to be able to sort of understand all the law, and there was a lot of religion there too, Norma, of course. And then I also needed someone very important from the pro-choice world and someone very important from the pro-life world. All of my characters, by the way, were based in Texas. That was where I centered my story. Of course, that's where Roe was filed. And Curtis was a fascinating man. He also grew up in a religious home in Texas. But something happened to him when he was in high school. His crush, a girl named Virginia, got pregnant, and he remembered that he's not a man, really, the teenager who got her pregnant was seen as this stud. He was the captain of the football team, and he sort of went on his merry way. Whereas Virginia's life was torpedoed. She became a pariah. She was no longer welcome in the school, no longer welcome in the church. Boyd was born in the 1930s, so this was a long time ago. And he felt that was horribly unfair. And it never left him. Well, he becomes a doctor, and there were other awakenings along the way, and he ends up starting to provide abortions in Texas pre-Roe. Obviously at great risk to his career. He would have gone to jail if he was discovered. Well, after Roe, he thinks, hey, everything now will be just fine. Of course, that's not the case. And he becomes one of the leaders of the pro-choice movement over time. To fast forward, because it's a long story, he develops the accepted method of second trimester abortion in this country, dilation and evacuation. And after his friend George Tiller is murdered, the abortion provider, he becomes the largest provider of third trimester abortion in America. But what interested me most of all about him, and why I selected him to sort of tell this story was, or to carry the sort of pro-choice mantle, was because decades before the rest of the movement was speaking of abortion as a social and moral good, he was doing so. President Clinton in the 90s had famously said that abortion ought to be safe, legal, and rare. Curtis said, why rare? It is something that empowers women. It enables them to lead the lives that they wish to lead. This is something that is an unadulterated good. And it was that impenitence about his work that really made me realize this is the person I'm going to write about.
Now, of course, you also profiled another doctor, Dr. Mildred Jefferson, who took, of course, the opposite stance on the issue, very much pro-life. Could tell us about her life as well.
She's fascinating. I mean, I keep saying that, but I guess they are. I chose that for reasons. This woman is an incredible woman, also from a tiny town in Texas, a very brilliant kid. All of these people, by the way, Linda Coffey, Curtis Boyd, and Mildred Jefferson graduated atop their classes, all very brilliant people. And Mildred becomes the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. But something happens. I got her FBI file and I was reading about something very sad there. So the pro-life community looks at Mildred as one of its saints. Basically, she left the rarefied world of surgery. She trained to be a surgeon. She left that all behind and all that comes with it to defend the unborn, they say. Well, she didn't simply do this because of conviction. What the FBI file revealed was that her career was completely, to use that word again, torpedoed by misogyny and racism. It was a shock to be reading these things. They were written in 1973. Just very powerful white male doctors speaking very openly about the fact that they didn't really particularly wish to be working with her. And until that point, until her career sort of fell off a cliff, she was an incredibly proud and self-confident person. And she said, self-determination is everything. If you will it, it is no dream. You can make it happen. Well, what ends up happening is that she sees that that isn't true. And she ends up becoming so disillusioned that she says to her husband, who, by the way, was a white man, they got married when interracial marriage was illegal in half this country. She says to him, and you know, I found him in Chile where he was living. She says to him, we are not bringing a child into this world. The world is too unjust. And then, of course, this is the same woman who, after she becomes one of the architects of the pro-life movement, politicizing abortion, bringing Ronald Reagan into the fold, on and on and on, becoming the head of the National Right to Life Committee, an incredibly important person. This is the same woman who says that every single conception must lead to birth. She eventually comes to hold the extreme position that abortion ought to never be allowed, not even that basically from conception on, it is a human being, and it is the exact opposite point of view that Curtis Boyd comes to occupy. He comes to feel that abortion ought to be legal right up until birth. And so you have these two people coming to occupy these absolutist sort of extreme points of view. And that's why I wrote about them. I wanted to show how we got here as a country. And even though I'll just add, even though I am pro-choice, and I mentioned that in my author's note, I thought it would be disingenuous not to. This is not a work of advocacy. This was the work of a journalism. And I stay out of it. And what I'm proudest of with this book is I've heard from both sides that they feel that they were fairly represented. And that makes me feel good because I did my very best to write about everyone with empathy and understanding so that we might, I'm not naive, I don't think we're going to read the book and all sort of kumbaya and everything will be fine. But I do believe that there is room for people to at least acknowledge that abortion is fraught for good reason. And that is what really motivated me as I spent these years writing this book.
I know you say in the book it's the most enduringly divisive case, and I absolutely wholly agree. Just quickly, I want to touch on one other person, Henry Wade. Of course, the other end of the case, Roe v. Wade. Just tell us a little bit about him as well.
He was the district attorney of Dallas County, and he was a tough man. He presided over an enormous number of executions, for example. Just to say what was utterly fascinating to me, I spoke to his son, Kim, who told me that Henry Wade had privately confessed to him that he was personally pro-choice. So even though he was charged with prosecuting people who violated the law, and he did so, he nonetheless privately felt that abortion ought to be legal. What was interesting was that he should not have been the one opposite Roe. Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey had accidentally only, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't remember all the words, but only sort of made him the representative defendant, as opposed to making it not just the county, but representative of all of Texas. And eventually, when the case goes to the Supreme Court, it is a member representing all of Texas, not just of Dallas, who is sort of arguing on behalf of the state. But Wade was a fascinating character to write about. And interestingly enough, Linda Coffey had thought about being a prosecutor and had actually thought that she might want to work with him. And so the very person who ends up sort of, pairing him in perpetuity with Wade had actually met with him and tried to get a job, but he only offered her some sort of lame job, because back in the early 1970s and late 1960s, a woman, no matter how brilliant and accomplished, wasn't going to be given a good job. And that was something that both Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington had experienced.
And let's talk about the decision itself. The justices were not unanimous. The two did not go in favor of it. They chose the 14th Amendment, woman's right to privacy, as the grounds for the decision. Even those who are often pro-choice have somewhat faulted that decision making. Let's discuss that a bit. What is the grounding
right.
and what is the context?
Fascinating. Yep. I mean, the one who most famously said that, who was pro-choice, was Justice Ginsburg. She felt that the right to an abortion ought to be grounded not in a right to privacy, but a right to equality. And what was so interesting to me, as a guy who majored in music theory in college and was just learning all about the law for the first time in writing this book, a lot of times legal arguments evolve. And so, just to give two other examples, Harry Blackmun, the justice who wrote the opinion in Roe, he originally sort of focused that right to an abortion. He focused it not on the woman, the pregnant woman, but on the doctor. It's much more geared towards sort of the right of a doctor to perform an abortion. It's kind of an amazing thing. And by the time he leaves the Supreme Court in 1994, he's completely changed and focuses solely on the woman, or almost entirely on the woman. Similarly, on the pro-life side, their argument has changed enormously. And Norma is involved. Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe, was involved in this migration too. For decades, the pro-life focused their arguments against abortion on the fetus. But in recent years, they've switched and they've focused on the pregnant woman, saying that abortion causes a woman emotional harm. Now, it's of course entirely true that a person who has an abortion may suffer emotionally. There are individual cases, but from a public health standpoint, even Dr. Koop, Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, who was very pro-life, said that effect on a public health standpoint is quote unquote minuscule. The great majority of women who have abortions report feeling relief, not regret. And what's so interesting about Norma's role in all of this, the man who is most responsible for changing that argument, the pro-life argument, was a lawyer named Alan Parker. And he represented Norma after she had become pro-life. And he used her. He filed a case on her behalf challenging Roe, saying that various historical conditions had changed, so Roe should no longer be the law. But he used that to sort of introduce the idea of what they call post-abortion syndrome into the judiciary. And that argument took root, and it rose right up to the Supreme Court when in 2007, Justice Kennedy cited one of Alan Parker's affidavits, these affidavits he collected from women who said that they had suffered emotionally. He cited one of those affidavits, thereby validating this sort of new method of argument. And that is an argument that we will be hearing from just in another few months when the Supreme Court takes up this case out of Mississippi and decides the fate of Roe.
Right. Of course, the Roe case originated in Texas. All eyes have been on Texas recently, with the Supreme Court allowing their 6-week prohibition to stand.
Yeah.
But I mentioned the Dobbs case will be heard in the next session of the Supreme Court. I know you take a very neutral approach, obviously, in your book, but where do you think this is heading, given the current makeup of the court?
Well, I mean, I think that this case out of Texas is insane in the sense that it deputizes private citizens, to report people who have anything to do with an abortion, whether they're driving them to the clinic or performing the abortion itself. That is not a recipe for a healthy country. And obviously 6 weeks is so early in a pregnancy that a lot of women don't even know they're pregnant then. But I really think we're going to be forgetting about this case before too long, because the Mississippi case could render abortion illegal in half the country. The organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights, they have a sort of state-by-state tally of which states are going to just sort of, illegalize abortion once the matter is handed back to the states, and it numbers in the 20s. So look, I don't think this conservative court took this case for fun. I think they took this case because they want to do something with it. And whether they overturn Roe in one fell swoop with it now, or whether abortion remains legal and Roe remains good law, but they further sort of eviscerate it, either way, Roe is in deep trouble. Roe says that abortion ought to be legal through viability, basically until roughly the 24th week, when the fetus can survive outside the womb. This case out of Mississippi says that abortion is legal only until the 15th week. So it's a flagrant violation of Roe. But more than that, it basically says it enables the court to say that all pre-viability bans on abortion can be constitutional. And so it's not like all of a sudden Roe will just be, it's not that abortion will only be cut down to the 15th week. It could be actually just cut out, period. So it is Roe has not been in this much danger since at least 1992 with the case of Casey, but it's probably never been in this much danger in all of its 50 years.
So before we wrap things up, I want to go back and talk about the human story, of course. And Norma did establish contact with the 3 daughters that she gave up for adoption, including Shelly Lynn. But tell me about how their connections came to be, and what kind of relationship did they develop before Norma died?
Well, all 3 daughters sort of suffered uniquely for their association with Norma. We mentioned that Shelly, when she was almost 19 years old, is sort of accosted in a parking lot and forevermore feels burdened not only by this great secret, but also by this sort of feeling that she's a symbol. And she carried that till today. The second child, her name was Jennifer. She had no idea who she'd been born to. When I found her, she had been desperate to find, just like all 3 sisters, they've been desperate to find one another. And what was helpful to her about finding, well, let me first say from a burden point of view, she had struggles with alcohol and drugs. She'd always wondered if maybe her biological mother or father, whoever they were, had struggled similarly. And it turns out that Norma had. And this was helpful to her to find out that sort of, and she's overcome those struggles, helpful to her to find out that sort of they were, as she saw it, that she had, let's say, predispositions to those struggles. Also, she's gay, and that was also something that helped her to feel connected to her biological mother. And when I found her, with her blessing, I connected her with Norma, and they had a sort of polite, cordial relationship until Norma died in 2017. So there were several years where they were in touch. And then there was Melissa, the eldest, who was the one who knew Norma. And as I mentioned before, Norma was truly unfit to be a mother. And she suffered having Norma in her life. To give one sort of horrible example, when she was about 5 years old, Norma showed up to see Melissa and locked her in a car all one rainy night, just so that she could be hanging out with her then partner. And what's fascinating about Melissa, and what is heroic about Melissa, is that Melissa said, you know what, after all these generations of struggle in my family, of women not being able to be real mothers to their children, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to become hell or high water, a good mother. And she is. She is a good mother to her two children, despite having been through a lot with a miserable ex-husband. And she even was there for Norma at the end of Norma's life, taking care of this woman who could never take care of her.
And then Shelly, her relationship with Shelly.
Well, so Shelly again was sort of very resistant to have anything to do with Norma. But Norma, and one thing Shelly was correctly wary of was the fact that Norma only reached out to her when it seemed that she would be able to sort of parlay this into some sort of like a traveling gig where they would go around and give talks and be paid. And Shelly didn't want any part of that spotlight. Well, at one point, Norma says, and I think charitably, she said, can I come visit you with Connie? And this was a few years after 1989, when she had the National Enquirer go find her. And Shelly said, well, I'm a little concerned about that, because how am I going to explain to my child that his grandmother is partnered with a woman? And Norma went ballistic and said to her, you need to thank me. And she said, why? And she said, for not aborting you. And when that happened, setting aside, of course, that she had obviously wanted to have the abortion, when that happened, Shelly said, I'm never speaking to this person again. And she never did. And one thing that was quite moving, though, was that as Norma was dying, Shelly did find it within herself to sort of feel for Norma. She felt for this woman whose life had been defined by abortion. She felt that very strongly, and she considered visiting her right at the end of her life, but in the end, she decided not to.
And I know you were there, actually, at Norma's deathbed. You obviously developed a very strong relationship with all of your subjects. How did that come to be? Was that something you expected as you pursued this?
Oh my goodness, it was very difficult. Norma was a complicated and difficult person, but I came to feel deeply for all of these people, and was mindful of the things that they had been through. But you're right, that's a complicated thing for a journalist, in a sense, to sort of embed himself with a family, within a family. And it was difficult sometimes over the years. but I was very open and transparent with everyone. I kept them sort of abreast of my writing and how the book was progressing and growing. It kept expanding from the daughters to Norma to Roe to the entirety of abortion in America. And, we all sort of kept going together. I was thankful that they were opening their lives to me. And I also, in turn, sort of, did everything I could to make them comfortable. Being, for example, telling them if ever I was going to speak to another person about them, etc. And of course, what they had most wanted, the daughters, was to be able to meet one another. And so the fact that I had been able to bring them together was for them a great source of relief. Also, I found their biological fathers, which was a very complicated thing to do. These were very fractured families, and so it was very difficult to find all of these people. So we kind of had a mutual understanding. We worked together nicely. There were some ups, there were some downs, but I believe that everybody, thank God, is happy with the result, with the book. And I hope that the country is too. I hope, thankfully the reviews have been good. I'd like to think that no matter where a person sort of stands on the issue, they'll agree that the book is fair. And it really is a deep dive. And I think that people will appreciate the fact that, abortion in America is complicated for good reason. You obviously have the two sort of extremes, saying abortion must always be legal, abortion must always be illegal. But the great majority of Americans believe that abortion ought to be legal to a point. Support drops enormously by trimester. And that was what Norma believed. So she was this wonderful window into this world. She believed that abortion ought to be legal through the first trimester. And again, that's exactly what the majority of Americans believe. So I think people who read the book will sort of nod along with a lot of the places that Norma ends up in, even though she's such a complicated and difficult figure.
Well, I second your thoughts on that. And I would say that anyone, no matter what side of the debate you fall upon, will find this to be a very compelling read. It's really an epic story, one that I think will have enduring value in history, and one of human drama that I think almost any family in America could relate to some degree. Wow, so I want to thank you again, Joshua, for talking to us, and congratulations again. And the book again, The Family Roe, An American Story. We'll let it go from there.
Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.